June 16, 1943, 14,000 feet above the Solomon Sea, north of Guadalcanal. The morning sun blazed off the canopy of Lieutenant Saburo Sakai's Mitsubishi A6M Zero as he banked lazily through scattered clouds, his eyes scanning the turquoise waters below. The air at this altitude was crisp, thin, perfect hunting weather. Behind him, 11 more Zeros from the Tainan Air Group held formation, their polished silver fuselages catching the light like a school of predatory fish. Sakai keyed his radio, his voice crackling with confidence. "Stay alert. American patrol should be in this sector." But there was no urgency in his tone. Why would there be? For 2 years, Japanese naval aviators had ruled these skies with absolute dominance. The Zero, officially the Nakajima A6M. Though pilots like Sakai flew the Mitsubishi variant, had carved a legend written in the wreckage of American Wildcats and Allied fighters. It could outturn anything in the sky, climb faster than seemed physically possible, and had a range that allowed it to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still return home. Sakai himself had 32 confirmed kills. The Zero was more than an aircraft to men like him. It was an extension of their Bushido spirit, their warrior's soul. The Americans had tried to challenge them with the F4F Wildcat stubby, sluggish things that could barely keep up in a straight line, let alone in a dogfight. Japanese pilots had learned to bait them into turning contests, where the Wildcat's heavier frame became a death sentence. The Americans had adapted with the thack weave, a defensive scissor pattern that could protect vulnerable Wildcats, but it was a defensive tactic. Defensive meant losing, just losing slowly. Then came the whispers. In May, reconnaissance reports had started filtering back to Japanese air bases. A new American fighter had been spotted larger than the Wildcat, carrying 6 50-caliber machine guns instead of 4. American radio chatter intercepted by intelligence officers referred to it as the Hellcat. The reports included grainy photographs, a thick-bodied aircraft with a distinctive bubble canopy and wide-set landing gear. It looked heavy. It looked slow. At the officers' mess on Rabaul, pilots had laughed at the photographs pinned to the ready room wall. Another American pig, one veteran had scoffed, sake warming his belly. They build fighters the way they build themselves fat and lazy. The joke had rippled through the assembled pilots. Even the more cautious among them, including Sakai, found it hard to imagine this barrel-shaped machine posing any real threat to the Zero's elegant lethality. But something had changed in the past 3 weeks. American patrols had become bolder. They no longer fled at the sight of Japanese formations. Several Zeros had failed to return from missions over the New Georgia Island group, their fates unknown. One pilot who'd managed to limp back to base with his Zero shot full of holes reported engaging a blue-gray fighter that hadn't fought like a Wildcat. "It didn't try to turn with me," the shaken pilot had said. "It just climbed away, then came back down with so much speed I couldn't evade." The firepower, he'd fallen silent, remembering. Sakai had dismissed it as the excuses of a careless pilot. Now, as his formation cruised through the brilliant Pacific morning, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Below, the Solomon chain stretched like emerald stepping stones through the blue. This was Japanese territory, one with blood and steel. Any American foolish enough to challenge them here would learn the same lesson countless others had. The Zero was supreme, and its pilots were the finest in the world. Sakai's eyes snapped to the position. There may be 5,000 feet below and 3 miles distant a formation of American fighters, their dark blue-gray paint making them hard to spot against the ocean. But they were there, and they were climbing, coming right at them. A predatory smile crossed Sakai's face. He keyed the radio. "All aircraft, prepare to engage. Standard tactics draw them into turning combat. Show these Americans what the Zero can do." As he spoke, he pushed his stick forward, leading his squadron into a shallow dive to build speed. The formation behind him followed with practiced precision, 12 fighters angling down like striking hawks. But as the range closed and the American formation resolved into clarity, Sakai felt the first whisper of something unfamiliar in his gut. These weren't Wildcats. They were larger, their wings thicker, their profiles matching those grainy photographs he'd seen. F6F Hellcats, 8 of them, flying in 4-plane sections with unusual discipline. And they weren't running. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Flatley watched the Japanese formation dive toward his section through the curved plexiglass of his Hellcat's canopy, his gloved hand steady on the throttle. At 34, Flatley was old for a fighter pilot, ancient by Pacific War standards, but he'd survived this long by being smarter than he was brave. Behind him, 7 more Hellcats from the F5 held their positions, and he could feel their tension through the radio silence. These boys had been flying Wildcats until 3 weeks ago. They'd been told the Hellcat would change everything. Now it was time to prove it. Steady, Flatley transmitted, his voice calm despite his heart hammering against his ribs. Let them commit. When I break, scissor pairs just like we drilled. The Zeros were closer now, their distinctive profiles unmistakable long noses, fixed landing gear, those graceful elliptical wings that could make them dance through the air like leaves in wind. Flatley had fought Zeros in his Wildcat over the Coral Sea. He'd seen good men die because they'd tried to turn with them, tried to fight the Zeros fight. The Wildcat had taught American pilots a hard lesson. You couldn't outmaneuver the Zero, so you had to outthink it. The Hellcat was built on that lesson, but with one critical difference. It didn't just have to survive the Zero, it could kill it. Flatley's eyes tracked the lead Zero. He could see the pilot now, probably a veteran given the confidence of that dive. 2,000 feet separation. 1,500. The Zero was pulling up slightly, preparing to yo-yo above them, and then drop down with an altitude advantage. Classic tactics. Flatley yanked his stick hard over, his Hellcat responding with surprising agility for an aircraft that weighed nearly 5 tons fully loaded. Behind him, his wingman Lieutenant J.G. Harris, Hal Jackson stayed glued to his wing, their two planes section braking in perfect coordination. The other Hellcat pairs scattered in opposing directions, denying the Zeros a simple target-rich environment. The lead Zero Sarkis aircraft followed Flatley's brake, rolling smoothly to pursue. But Flatley didn't try to outturn him. Instead, he shoved his throttle to the firewall and his stick forward. The massive radial engine roared, and the Hellcat accelerated like it had been kicked. In his Zero, Sarkai blinked in surprise. The American fighter was pulling away from him in the dive, actually opening the distance despite his pursuit. Impossible. The Zero could outrun any American fighter in service. But his airspeed indicator told the truth. The Hellcat was faster in the dive, much faster. He pulled harder on his stick, trying to follow, but the American aircraft was already leveling out 300 feet below him and beginning to climb again, climbing at a rate that made Sarkai's blood run cold. The Hellcat's nose came up at a steep angle, the big Pratt and Whitney hauling it skyward with brute force that defied the Zero's elegant aerodynamics. Flatley grunted against the G-forces, watching his altimeter wind up like a clock spring. 4,000 feet of separation had become 500 in seconds. He rolled inverted at the top of his zoom climb, spotted the Zero now desperately trying to follow, and pulled through into a high-side attack. Sarko saw the Hellcat coming down at him from above and behind exactly where he should have been, and instinctively broke left, throwing his Zero into the sharp turn that had saved his life a dozen times before. The Zero snapped around in a turn so tight it would have torn the wings of most aircraft. But Flatley didn't follow the turn. He'd already learned that lesson in his Wildcat days. Instead, he pulled up sharply, bleeding of just enough speed to avoid overshooting, then half-rolled and came down again from a different angle. The Zero was completing its turn, its speed scrubbed off by the violent maneuver, and Sarkai was looking the wrong direction. Flatley's thumb found the trigger on his stick. 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously, their combined rate of fire putting 4,800 rounds per minute into the air. The sound was apocalyptic, a thunderous that shook the entire airframe. Tracers walked across the sky in 6 brilliant streams, and Flatley watched them converge on the Zero's fuselage like fingers closing into a fist. The effect was catastrophic. The Zero, built for speed and maneuverability, had sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to achieve its performance. American 50 caliber rounds, each one nearly as long as a man's hand, and weighing almost 2 ounces, ripped through the thin aluminum skin like it was rice paper. Sarkai's Zero shuddered as rounds punched through the engine cowling, the cockpit, the wing roots. His canopy shattered. His instrument panel exploded into fragments. Something hot and sharp tore through his left shoulder, and he screamed, his stick going slack. The Zero's left wing began trailing smoke thick, black smoke that told a story of ruptured fuel lines and igniting aviation gas. Harris Jackson had followed Flatley's example, using the Hellcat's superior speed and power to deny his Zero opponent the turning fight it wanted. When the Japanese pilot had finally committed to a hard turn, Jackson had simply climbed away, reversed, and come back with a crushing speed advantage. His 6 guns had torn the Zero apart in a 3-second burst, the lightweight Japanese fighter disintegrating under the hammering fire. Jackson watched pieces of wing and fuselage tumble away as the Zero spun toward the ocean, trailing fire. Across the sky, the pattern repeated itself. The Zeros, piloted by some of Japan's best aviators, found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to play by the rules they'd mastered. The Hellcats wouldn't turn. They'd boom and zoom, using speed and climb rate the Zeros couldn't match. And when those 650 calibers found their mark, the results were devastating. Ensign Robert Bobby Duncan, 22 years old and flying his 4th combat mission, found himself pursued by 2 Zeros whose pilots were trying to sandwich him in a classic pincer. His hands were shaking on the stick, his breath coming in gasps, but he remembered Flatley's briefing. Speed is life. Altitude is life insurance. Don't dogfight, dictate the fight. Bobby shoved everything forward, diving away from the Zeros with his R280 bellowing defiance. The Zeros followed, but they were slower in the dive, and when Bobby pulled up into a chandelle, a climbing turn that used his speed and power to gain altitude while changing direction, the Zeros couldn't follow without stalling. He came back down on the trailing Zero with his guns blazing, and the Japanese fighter came apart in a spray of debris and fire. The second Zero pilot saw his wingman die and made a decision born of 2 years of absolute aerial superiority. He poured into a vertical climb, trying to use the Zero's legendary climb rate to escape above the American. It was a maneuver that had worked against every Allied fighter he'd ever faced. The Hellcat followed him up. Bobby Duncan's eyes went wide as his altimeter spun upward and the Hellcat just kept climbing, its massive engine refusing to quit. The Zero ahead was slowing, its nose starting to drop as it approached its ceiling. Bobby's thumb found the trigger, and even in the thin air at altitude, his 6 guns delivered their verdict. The Zero shuddered, rolled onto its back, and fell away smoking. Bobby keyed his radio, his voice cracking with adrenaline. Splash 2. I got 2. Stay focused, Duncan. Flatley's voice cut through the chaos. Check your 6. Stay in pairs. The engagement had lasted less than 4 minutes, but the sky told a story of absolute reversal. Black smoke trails marked the death trajectories of 5 Zeros, their burning wreckage spiraling toward the Solomon Sea below. Flatley resisted the urge to pursue the fleeing Zeros. He'd lost too many friends who chased damaged enemy aircraft into traps. Instead, he brought his section around in a wide arc, taking stock. His radio crackled with voices, excited, disbelieving voices. Did you see that? My guns just soared right through him. Where'd they go? Are they retreating? Lieutenant Robert Bob Thompson's observation was accurate. His Hellcat had absorbed fire that would have shredded a Zero's control surfaces, but the rounds had simply punched through the armored fuselage without hitting anything critical. The Hellcat had been designed with brutal lessons learned from 2 years of Pacific combat. Armor plate behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing fuel tanks that could take hits without exploding, and redundant control systems. It could take punishment and keep fighting. Flatley counted his section. 8 Hellcats had engaged 12 Zeros. All 8 Hellcats were still flying. 7 Zeros were confirmed destroyed or heavily damaged. 0 American losses. All aircraft, form on me, Flatley transmitted. We're going home. As the Hellcat formation turned southeast toward Guadalcanal, Flatley allowed himself a moment to process what had just happened. Saburo Sakai managed to ditch his smoking Zero in the water 3 miles from a small island in the New Georgia group. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, and salt water flooded his shattered canopy as the aircraft settled. With his left shoulder screaming in agony, he managed to extract himself from the cockpit and inflate his life vest. He floated there, watching his Zero, his beautiful, legendary Zero, slip beneath the waves like a dying samurai committing seppuku. Around him, the ocean was spotted with debris and oil slicks. He could see 2 other parachutes in the distance, other survivors from his squadron, but so many were simply gone. Tanaka, who'd scored 18 kills. Yoshida, who could make a Zero dance like a living thing. Nakamura, who'd survived midway. All gone, swatted from the sky by these new American fighters in minutes. It took 6 hours for a Japanese float plane to locate and retrieve Sakai and the 2 other survivors. By the time they returned to Rabor, the sun was setting, painting the sky the color of blood. Sakai was immediately taken to the base hospital, where a surgeon worked to remove 50 caliber fragments from his shoulder. The doctor said he was lucky the round had fragmented against his seat armor. A direct hit would have torn his arm off. Sakai didn't feel lucky. That evening, as morphine dulled his pain, he was visited by Commander Nakajima, the air group's operations officer. Nakajima's face was grave. We need your report, Lieutenant. What happened up there? Sakai stared at the ceiling, seeing again that blue-grey Hellcat pulling away from him in the dive, climbing away when he tried to pursue, then falling on him from above with those terrible guns. "The Americans have a new fighter," he said quietly. "It's faster than a Zero in a dive. It climbs as well as we do, maybe better. It has much more firepower, and it's heavily armored. Our 7.7mm guns do almost nothing to it." Nakajima frowned. "But the Zero can still outturn it." "Yes, our pilots can use superior maneuverability. They won't turn with us." Sakai's voice was flat, emotionless. "They've learned. They use speed and altitude. They attack from above, fire, and escape before we can respond. If we try to turn, they simply climb away and attack again. We can't catch them. We can't escape them. And when their guns hit..." He trailed off, remembering the sound of his aircraft being torn apart. Nakajima was silent for a long moment. "How many did they have?" "8 aircraft. We had 12. Sakai closed his eyes. "We lost 7. They lost none." The numbers hung in the air like an indictment. For 2 years, such casualty ratios had favored Japanese pilots by margins of 10 or 20 to 1. Now, in a single engagement, the equation had reversed. Nakajima left without another word. Sakai learned later that an emergency conference had been called with all squadron commanders. The reports from his engagement weren't isolated across the Solomon Islands. Wherever the new Hellcats appeared, the story was the same. Japanese losses were mounting catastrophically. American losses were minimal. The whispers Sakai had heard, the rumors he'd dismissed, were more than pilot excuses or American propaganda. The F6F Hellcat was real. It was deadly. And it was everywhere. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, Jimmy Flatley's squadron landed to a hero's welcome. Ground crews counted the bullet holes in the returning Hellcats. Most had only superficial damage, nothing that couldn't be patched in a few hours. The armament crews rearmed the guns, the fuel trucks topped of the tanks, and within 2 hours, the same 8 Hellcats were ready for another mission. That night, in the makeshift officer's glove, really just a tent with a kerosene stove, and some liberated Japanese beer, Flatley's pilots celebrated, but their commander noticed something important. They weren't cocky. They were relieved. For 2 years, American naval aviators had gone into the sky knowing they were flying inferior aircraft, that survival depended more on tactics and luck than on their machines. The Wildcat had been tough and reliable, but it had never been a match for the Zero in any metric except durability. The Hellcat changed everything. It was faster. It could climb with the Zero. It could dive away when needed. It could take horrific damage and keep flying. And those 650 caliber guns could shred a Zero in seconds. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American pilots had an aircraft that was genuinely superior to what the Japanese could field. Flatley raised his canteen cup filled with medicinal whiskey and his pilots fell silent. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "today we proved something. The Zero is beatable, not because we're better pilots than the Japanese, some of them are damn good, but because we have a better aircraft and better tactics. The Hellcat lets us dictate the fight. It lets us play to our strengths and deny them theirs." He paused, looking at each young face in the tent. "The Japanese made fun of our new fighter. They called it fat and slow. They thought it would be easy prey." A grim smile crossed his face. "I expect they're having a different conversation tonight." He was right. At bases across Rabor, Japanese pilots who'd spent 2 years as undisputed masters of the Pacific sky were discovering a new and unfamiliar emotion: fear. The Americans weren't running anymore. They were hunting. And their new fighter, the aircraft Japanese pilots had marked as too heavy and too slow, was proving to be a perfectly designed Zero killer. In the months that followed June 16, 1943, the F6F Hellcat would compile a kill ratio of 19 to 1 against Japanese aircraft. It would shoot down more enemy planes than any other Allied fighter of World War II, over 5,100 confirmed kills.